Hello, and this is the beginning of Asian history. We're going to be talking in this course, this edition, we're going to be talking about Eastern Asia. We're not going to be talking about India. We have tried that in the past and it's really too much. So we're going to be concentrating on China. We're going to be concentrating on Japan. We'll certainly talk about Korea, the two Koreas, Vietnam. And that would really preoccupy us, and that's plenty. You could easily teach a course on any one of those countries, and that course would be lengthy, detailed. So unfortunately, we will leave out the history of India, which is also fascinating, of course. But we have our limitations. So let us begin. We're going to talk about, first of all, the beginning, the topic, and we go back to the very beginning, early modern, kind of late traditional, but early modern East Asia. And let's talk about its foundations, traditions, and commonalities. For example, language, religion, and so on. Let's lay a foundation for that. So first of all, geographical parameters. Let us talk about geographical parameters, and let us begin with China. And here we're talking about geography, but let us remember that geography doesn't mean that everything is predetermined, whether you have rivers, mountains, how much agriculture, soils, and so on, but it's extremely important, and we can hardly deny it. For example, one of the most important things about East Asia is that virtually every country there has coastline, and that means fishing. And Japan in particular, which is simply a series of islands, going to rely very much on fishing and what's available on the waters, particularly since Japan has certain limitations agriculturally. So China, let's begin with China. The north is dominated by the Yellow River. It flows into the Yellow Sea. And again, I'll ask you, I won't try to produce maps, but take a look at the map of China and East Asia, and that'll give you some sense of what we're talking about. And of course, in any case, the Yellow River flows into the Yellow Sea, which is north of what is called the Guangdong Peninsula. Climate, very temperate, scarce rainfall, which means not necessarily good for agriculture. North is good for some agriculture. It's been good for wheat, beans, soybeans, and sorghum, the kinds of crops that we normally associate with our own country, and with other countries, we don't usually think of that in China. But of course, rice is going to be important as well, but it's going to be even more important to the south. In the south, it's still talking about China, rain is abundant, climate is semi-tropical, but the soil is poor generally. The south has a major river system, the Yangtze River, and it became very early on good for rice, but after the areas where it could be grown had been drained, and this took quite a few centuries actually, and it was mostly in the Yangtze Basin, the river that I just mentioned. The Yangtze is navigable, or at least it was, and still is, and for the most part, 1,500 miles long, so it's one of the longest rivers. And then further yet to the south, you come to Canton and Hong Kong, which is a very rich delta. Hong Kong, of course, is an island, and Canton is the southern part of China, mainland China. And it does have some rich agriculture there. We all know Hong Kong because it's in the news recently because of democratic movements that have gone on there. Even further south, we come to mountains and of course, a somewhat tropical climate already, and jungle. And then that takes us directly into Vietnam. Let me talk about Vietnam just a bit. In Vietnam, the north is dominated by the Red River, and that acts as a kind of a center of life, as rivers do in many cultures and countries. The south in Vietnam is dominated by the Mekong and its rich delta. And those of you familiar with the Vietnam War some decades ago will remember, or at least you might remember now, as I mentioned it, it's a very long river, and it was often the very center of much of the fighting that went on. And in any case, it has a very rich delta also. Vietnam is a country that's mostly made up of mountains, 25% of its land is suitable for farming, and it has always made feeding its population difficult. It simply doesn't have the arable agriculture, the agriculture that needs to feed its own population, although Vietnam is also known as a sort of a rice basin as well, and it has produced certainly its share of rice. Okay. Well, in any case, Vietnam, like China, relies heavily on the ocean for its food supply. And rice, as I said, is still important despite the limitations of agriculture. And rice is king of agriculture there. And as a matter of fact, because it can be grown so well, it has often attracted other countries and therefore imperialist type relationships, domination and so forth and so on. So rice plays a critical role, both in terms of relations of countries and in terms of Vietnam itself internally. Mentioned that the food supply of Vietnam is very heavily related, relying on the ocean, which is of course true. Those of you who like cuisine of the countries that I'm talking about probably will have noticed the presence of seafood in these cuisines, but especially true of Vietnam. I personally have become well, very, very, very affectionate when it comes to Vietnamese cuisine. That is to say, I love it. And in certain states, particularly California, you can find Vietnamese food, which is really quite extraordinary. Even these sort of mom and pop type restaurants, really exquisite. Vietnam was controlled by China early in its history. Later on, this is very early actually, it threw out the Chinese yoke, and that's the 10th century. And there was a short period of Chinese domination later, 1401 to 1427. In the more modern period, as we'll see soon enough, the French get involved in Vietnam. That's particularly true in the 19th century, even a little bit earlier. And in the 19th century, France actually colonizes Vietnam, and the French will remain there all the way to the 20th century when the United States will get involved after World War II. And we'll reserve that for a later discussion. Korea. Korea also depends on the ocean for food, like the other countries, and it also, like them, uses the ocean for trade. Rice here is also dominant. The best farmland is in the south, and it's also the best area for mineral resources, water power, and timber. Are in the north. I should say mineral resources, water power, and timber are all associated more with the north. So best farmland in the south, but many of the other things in the north, and that's obviously a problem when you have a divided Korea. Mountains divide the country. It was, however, unified in the 7th century. So it was at the previous, many centuries ago, actually divided like it is today. And Korea is protected in the north by a mountain chain. Korea itself is a peninsula, which you can easily find on a map of East Asia. And of course, Korea also experienced Chinese aggression, as so many smaller countries have in the remote past. And that was the 2nd century before Christ, BCE, when China established colonies in Korea in the Red River Basin. And the largest was near present-day Pyongyang, in the north, which is one of the chief cities of North Korea. Nevertheless, Korea has always remained independent of China, except for a period of Mongol dominance. And of course, this period of dominance, if one comes to a later period, of course, then we're talking about Japan, which will dominate Korea, but that's much later in the 20th century. Both Vietnam and Korea acknowledge the Chinese civilization. They were tremendously affected by it. China has affected literally much of Asia, if not all of Asia, throughout much of the history. We'll see that China will be a very dominant country for many, many centuries. And what we're beginning to experience now as China begins to rise is actually a return to the status that it enjoyed for centuries. Until roughly into the 15th century. And even then, China, despite sort of the rise of the West, is going to be a very powerful player, at least in East Asia and throughout much of Asia, and particularly to the south as well. Let's talk about Japan. Japan relies heavily on rice. It relied even more heavily on rice in previous centuries and even into the 20th century. Rice growing is concentrated on Honshu, which is Japan's main island. And of course, Japan also relies heavily on the sea for food because it is an island. Because Japan's an island, no doubt that's helped it to remain independent, even in modern times. And Japan, like many of the other countries, is very mountainous. And this has been a problem for agriculture because about 20% of Japan's land, only 20% can actually be farmed successfully. Let's talk about our next topic, which is rice and material culture. I've mentioned rice already many times, and that's because rice is fundamental not only to agriculture, but to culture generally, material culture. It's always been the center of really of not only agriculture, but of the Chinese cuisine. One finds, you go to a Chinese restaurant even now, or a Japanese restaurant, and you're going to be served very likely with rice. Of course, that's true for other countries as well. In any case, rice dominates. Until the 7th century, farmers in the drier north grew millet, not rice. In the 7th century, they switched to wheat and millet, while in the south, wheat became dominant. And after that, the majority of East Asians actually lived on wheat. Rice, of course, is going to become prominent and will remain prominent. Why rice? Well, rice provides nutrition in the same amount of land as virtually any other crop, and perhaps more. It can be grown under most conditions. It does not require fertilizers. It can produce 3 crops a year if there's sufficient water. So the result is that rice is often grown in paddies, rice paddies. And it does depend, it's very intensive. It's very intensive agriculture. And of course, it depends on water very much. It can be grown under most conditions. It does not require fertilizers. And so, 3 crops a year, that's really more than you're going to get out of virtually any other crop. And you might say, well, why is that? And then the reason for that is because it doesn't exhaust the fertility of rice paddies, right? Many varieties, you go into any of the Oriental markets here in St. Louis, you're going to find that there are many varieties for sale there as well. No doubt there's many more that they don't have, but many of them include drought-resistant varieties, early spring varieties, and so on. And so they can be adapted to different conditions. Rice is easy to transport. It gives a very high yield. And as I said, rice is labor intensive, so high density populations have inevitably turned to rice because you don't need as much land. You need adequate water supplies, but you don't need as much land, and you don't have to worry about rotation because the nutrients are basically more or less left in the soil. And of course, labor intensive. China, for example, always has had such a large population that you can farm rice without needing mechanical systems because you have the labor. So really, labor intensive rice seem to go together. High density populations inevitably have turned to rice. Material culture. Let's talk about that. Some of us are aware already that China has really been in the forefront of the development when it comes to technology. And much of the technology that the West actually developed really went back to China. China had it first. For example, and it's hard for us to understand this, but if you go back to about the 17th century, East Asia was as advanced as much as Europe in technology and living standards. And what we're finding out is that even now, or beginning again, however you want to look at it, China has had a resurgence in technological developments. Yes, it's true that they have taken what we have in the West, but they are beginning to develop their own technology. Just think of the struggle over 5G that's going on even as we talk now. China invented paper, something we take for granted, something we can hardly live without, even in this technological age of the computer. And of course, it was even more important before. Paper, extremely important, because before then you had parchment, and that was a much more difficult thing to produce, more expensive, not as easily transported, and so on and so forth. So it's a major invention. We may not think of paper as one of the main things. We think of other things. We may think, well, paper doesn't compare to computers, but look, without paper, there's no history. Without paper, you're not. It's very, very, very difficult to have documents as we understand them. We have electronic documents now. That's true. Notice they're not replacing paper, not yet anyway. China also gave Europe gunpowder, printing, and the compass. Do I need to say that gunpowder revolutionized the world? It gave us, well, more efficient ways of prosecuting wars, making war, killing each other. One might say, well, that doesn't sound like much of an advance, but it certainly has enabled the West to become dominant. It's not just that the West has philosophers who are so brilliant. The West has often imposed itself using gunpowder that was actually developed in China, where they didn't actually use it in order to conquer other countries, at least not that I'm aware of. Printing, of course, revolutionized the West. The Chinese had it first, and they didn't utilize it in the way that we would, perhaps, but printing is going to completely transform Europe. For example, printing gives major voice, or gave major voice to the Protestant Reformation, the ideas of Martin Luther. It really countered the monopoly that the church had over learning, understanding, and so forth and so on. And the compass, well, maybe the Chinese would have preferred not to have invented that, because that gave the Europeans the ability to essentially sail around the world and guess what? Find China, although that took a little while. And the countries that Columbus came to actually were not Chinese, were they? But the compass certainly made many things possible, many things available. It really helped the West to expand its own powers, clearly. China goes beyond that. The porcelain and silk, for example, are long-standing productions that come from China, very fine porcelains, the entire silk industry, which actually the French developed in the 19th century, really owed quite a bit to the Chinese. Among other things, from Asia, we have the submarines. This is not China in this case, this is Korea. And of course, watertight ships. And that, to a large extent, was also Chinese. Some of the great sailing vessels, which were much larger than what the Europeans had, if you just look at Columbus and what he was sailing in. If you go back to the 15th century, you'll see that the Chinese vessels were, well, I can't say what the exact ratio was, but if you just look at a picture of them and compare them, Chinese vessels looked to me like the 10, 15, 20 times larger, and they sailed around in the 15th century in large fleets, much larger than the Europeans would have. I mentioned cuisines, and of course, if you want wonderful cuisines, then you're talking about Chinese food, which I really love very much. Thai food, very distinguished cuisine. Japanese food. If you like sushi, then you love the Japanese food, and there's many other things I have. And as I said earlier, I am particularly partial to the Vietnamese food, and there's a number of restaurants right here in town that are decent and have very nice menus, to say the least. So cuisines. Japan, yes, Japan, not us, invented the first modular houses. You know, that's become a big thing, and maybe it's going to become even bigger. There's been all sorts of experiments in the 20th century, into the 21st century with modular houses. That's where you produce essentially trailers, for example, modular houses, but that's where you produce something that you can simply keep reproducing very easily. And sort of portable. You manufacture things off-site, and then you simply assemble things wherever you want them assembled. China and Korea devised the first flus to battle the winter cold. That is not flu as in influenza, but flus as in chimney, making it possible to warm the house without actually burning the house down. And we owe much in the areas of theater, tea, and jade. If you like tea and you're willing to drink tea once in a while instead of coffee, well, the Chinese have given us some wonderful teas, and so have the many different areas of the Orient, all kinds of flavors. Theater, well, if you're familiar with Kabuki theater, it's highly formalized theater, but very dramatic, often so dramatic that it had to be suspended. It's a Japanese form of theater because people would get so involved, theater goers would get so involved in the dramas on stage. So at one point, what happened was that women would no longer be part of the dramatic presentation, but be all men, maybe to tone things down a little bit. I don't know if that actually works, but, and then of course, jade, if you like fine art, and if you like jade as a material, it is very beautiful, green material, which people have used in order to make small statuary, among other things. Certainly very pleasant to touch and to look at. Let's go on to topic 3, theories of the natural order, language and writing. First of all, theories of the natural order. Universe, according to the Chinese and in East Asia, was dynamic and not static. We'd probably agree with them on that, right? In other words, nature is not eternal, it's constantly evolving, not static. Everything is structured, and this is the way that Chinese and some East Asians have seen things, not just Chinese. Everything is structured and animated by the interaction of 2 different principles, which they call yin and yang. I don't think we have anything quite like this in the West. Yin is feminine, passive, negative, and weak. And I suppose that goes back to a sort of a patriarchal way of viewing the world. Yang is masculine, active, positive, and strong. Yin is cold and winter, yang is hot and summer. Yin is response, yang is stimulus. And for those of you who like flags, interested in flags, you'll see that South Korea has this principle in its flag. The 5 phases of wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. These represent the dynamic self-movement of the world. Actually, if you read Greek philosophy, it might sound a little bit like that too, in terms of the elements and how they act and interact. So for many East Asians, this principle yin-yang is behind this movement, this sort of dynamic movement of the elements. And therefore the world is not static, it doesn't stay still. And one might say, well, it's certainly true of history, right? And it's definitely true of the way that nature was viewed, the universe itself, the cosmos was viewed. All right, so it's a kind of patriarchal view as well, as I said. Let's talk about language and writing. And as we know, there's a vast number of the Chinese languages, and it seems that if you're not familiar with these, and I'm not, then you can constantly get surprises. One of my very best friends is from the Philippines, but he actually originally was from South China. He spoke a kind of Chinese kind of dialect there that's not widely spoken. But in any case, there are a number, we're all familiar with, Cantonese and various Mandarin and so forth and so on. So there's a number of Chinese languages, and they do appear to be part of a single family of languages called the Sino-Tibetan. Sino standard for China or Chinese, Sino-Tibetan family. Vietnamese may be in the same family, or it may be unique. There is no consensus. It may also be in the same family as the Khmer Mon, which is spoken in Cambodia, and the Khmer Mountain people who live in Cambodia. Korean and Japanese are it's called Altaic, Euro-Altaic is the full form of that, Altaic languages. And they differ from Chinese in sound and cadence. They have complicated grammars. It's very hard for Westerners to understand the grammar in the Chinese grammar, because, as I understand it, it's not so complicated. Because, for example, they don't have tenses, and it's very difficult. Everything is by context. This is at least what my Chinese friends have told me. So, there's Korean and Japanese are quite simply very different. Chinese writing has gone through many, many phases. We know it as today as compound characters, which can take considerable time to learn, I'm sure. Previously, they were pictographs, ideographs, phonograms, many things. Now they become compound characters, which school children, no doubt, spend many, many years learning, and even adults, no doubt, spend time learning as well. Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese had no script prior to the introduction of Chinese writing. And around 1000, these cultures began turning toward their own phonetic scripts. But they were still influenced by Chinese writing. In China, a vernacular developed that was totally different, totally different from the classical Chinese language. And this is what will persist all the way into the 20th century. So the Chinese language has certainly developed over time, and has developed many different forms until it became what it is now today. And finally, let's talk about the topic 4. Topic 4 is Confucianism. So it's religion, or the family of religion, because Confucianism isn't necessarily a religion. Confucius was a learned scholar, but he was not a god or deity, nor was he ever transformed into one by people who believed in his ideas and system. So Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and syncretism, what are they? What do they mean? Well, Confucianism, Confucius' years are roughly 549 to 449. Confucius believed that human nature was basically good, but this nature had to be nourished. If a ruler wasn't benevolent, he or she would lose the mandate of heaven, and the dynasty would fall. So one had to stay within the universal moral laws, and therefore governance had to be, you might say, in the interest of, to the benefit of those who were being governed, and those who would not follow that, the mandate of heaven, could rely on their dynasty collapsing. The fall would be preceded by droughts, earthquakes, floods, and so on. And this is from the 4 books, which sort of analyzes and describes all of this. Confucius also stressed good family relations. Everybody in a family should be devoted to the family and loyal. Sons and daughters should be obedient. Patriarchy was the model, but the father owed the family protection and loyalty also. So it's sort of always, but the father is the figure. He's the patriarch. He's the head of the family. One can see that if patriarchy becomes the system within the Confucianism, that's a very convenient thing once the state arises, because then you could say that the state becomes sort of like the father of the people, and it's sort of a hierarchy all the way from top down. So the family is taken care of by the father, but they have to be obedient. He has to protect them, but obedience is the model. Patriarchy is the model. Beyond obedience to rulers and the family, everybody must have a sense of loyalty to the entire community. And that, of course, once again, the same thing. A feeling of obligation, yes, of all to all, but a feeling especially of obligation to serve the patriarchal head, not only of the family, but of the nation. So what does Confucius counsel? Compassion as well as duty, right? So there must be a sense of mutual sort of obligation, in a way, of being attached to this system, but there's a hierarchy. It's a definite hierarchy, and one has a place within that hierarchy that should not be challenged or abridged in any way. Confucius believed that all could become sage by recovering their lost and original nature. Thus, he believed in self-cultivation, self-learning, and that becomes a very big thing in Asiatic cultures. It's eventually incorporated into really serving the state. And one should be learned in order to sort of run the state. So self-cultivation is a very big thing. I think our version of that is sort of self-learning nowadays, right? Teaching ourselves. And we should all be cultivated. And of course, that also means we should all observe the hierarchy, which he believed in as well. He stressed the relation between self-cultivation and good government. And this became the basis for the meritocratic system and the civil service, that is government examination, which would be used in China, Korea, and Vietnam. So it's a very interesting system. It talks about meritocracy, but at the same time, it's not always going to really work that way, but it sounds like it does and will. So meritocracy, that means to say through self-cultivation, you acquire knowledge, you acquire skills, you acquire the knowledge of how to good governance and your place in it. And everything will be regulated accordingly through an exam system, so to speak, informal and formal, which will enable you to sort of move through this preordained hierarchy. Okay, sounds like everybody can do well, not necessarily. So self-cultivation and good government, and that is to say that self-cultivation essentially is understanding the sort of the moral universe, the moral cosmos, and living within that and bringing that to government. All right. This will be a system. I mean, government examination, meritocracy will be a system that will be widely used in China, Korea, and Vietnam. All right. Taoism. Let's talk about Taoism. Long ago, I remember reading the Tao when I was still an undergrad. The Tao Te Ching about Lao Tzu. This is the 6th century about. We don't know the exact years when he lived. This particular belief, Taoism, which can be spelled in a number of different ways, D-A-O-I-S-M or T-A-O-I-S-M, never really spreads beyond China. It's against logic. It's a sort of mystical type of, let's call it religion. But in any case, it's mystical. The Tao is indefinable. It represents the source of all active power in the universe. That power is not necessarily referred to as a god, but it's some sort of a power that exists in the world, in the natural world, and it's not. It's talking about nature and natural world, the cosmos, but not in human relationships, as in Confucius. So one was supposed to let oneself go, and that is to say, to sort of leave this world behind in order to realize the way of the Tao, right? To be in touch with your own feelings. Getting in touch with your own feelings sort of transports you from the limitations of the material world into a world which you actually can't control through your belief. So the idea is not to find meaning in the world around you, but essentially to try to find the way of the Tao and to sort of merge yourself with this larger cosmos or universe. Buddhism goes back roughly 5-6 centuries before the birth of Christ. The years are simply approximate, and they are 563 to 483. The man, he was born in India, what is now India, what is India then, Siddhartha Gautama. He was the founder of Buddhism. Buddhism certainly influenced China in the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries. It would come to Korea and Japan from China soon afterwards. Vietnam developed what some have referred to, your text actually refers to, the Chinese-based Buddhist faith. And that particular faith it was very popular, still is to some extent in Vietnam, despite the fact that it's communist a country. I don't know that I don't think Buddhism is, maybe it's not as widely practiced now, but it was quite popular. During the Vietnam War, Buddhist monks were extremely active and opposing the war and opposing the presence actually of American troops there and Western troops in Vietnam, and were almost on a daily basis, I remember this, immolating themselves, burning themselves to death as a sort of kind of in protest of the war. And they had tremendous impact, moral impact. And unfortunately, they weren't able to stop the war. Buddhism began as a spiritual quest of a small group, and it grew into a universal faith with wide appeal. The core beliefs are defined in the Four Noble Truths. I once had the privilege of studying Buddhism for a rather extended period, which I found quite fascinating. Here's the Four Noble Truths. The first truth: life is suffering, pain, and unhappiness is not avoidable. Well, that sounds like not Buddhism, but a lot of other things, right? Death is not the answer, say the Buddhists, but they believed that there was a human soul, and this soul was reincarnated. Buddhists believed in karma. For every action, there's a moral reaction. Excuse me. If a person lived a good life, then he or she would be reincarnated at a higher level. Evil would lead in the opposite direction, and the ultimate goal was not to be born an emperor or rich, but to achieve nirvana and not to be reborn at all. So, in other words, if you don't live a good life, if you're not good to your neighbors, if you are mean to other people, if you steal things that really don't belong to you, if you value things even in this life, in this earth, then it's a very good chance that you'll come back as a I don't want to insult any insects, but there's a very good chance that you'll come back maybe as a grasshopper or some lower form of life, or that you'll come back as one of the pariahs, one of the unmentionables. That is to say, because the social structure always had the different kinds of groupings. There's kind of a strict hierarchy. So you need to lead a good life, and if you lead a good life, then you sort of when you're reincarnated, you might come back at a higher level. But if you really lead a really good spiritual type life, and you understand really nirvana, you kind of give up things in this life because you know that they're not all that important anyway, and they're certainly not important compared to eternity. There's a very good chance you won't be reincarnated at all. And that, of course, was exactly the belief of the early Buddhists and Buddhists now, that you won't be reborn into this terrible world and have to undergo all these terrible, terrible things that occur here, such as pandemics, political turmoil, racial strife, and so on and so forth. You'll be born outside of that, where your soul can merge maybe with the great soul of being. Okay. The second great truth, is that kind of explains it first. The cause of human suffering is desire and craving, right? So if you simply can withdraw from the world, as Siddhartha, by the way, believed, and Siddhartha Gautama, and the whole idea, Buddhists would later say that by the age of 40, you should already be fully withdrawn from the world. It should not mean so much to you. You should not care about material things. It shouldn't matter to you what your plates look like, how big your house is, and et cetera, et cetera. You should be already withdrawing. So the cause of human suffering is because we want too much. We desire too much. We're never satisfied, right? The third truth, the key to ending suffering, was to end craving and desire. Well, that makes sense. And the fourth truth, there was an eightfold path to accomplish this: right views, right intention, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration, right? And I well remember the recommendation of my professor. He said we should all read Muni Sadhu, because Muni Sadhu would teach you concentration. So much so that you would eventually be able to literally control yourself, your body, even your heartbeat, until you literally would withdraw from everything. It was the whole point. It was to concentrate on everything. My professor always said it was possible. He said he could do it. I don't know. I tried a couple times. I never did it. I did read Muni Sadhu. In any case, I never achieved nirvana, the ultimate in sort of salvation. And in any case, so all these things, the right intentions, right views, concentration, right? And of course, the religious life to Buddhists meant essentially celibacy, right? Vegetarianism, so you don't kill animals. And I one of my friends, by the way, is a Buddhist. He even went to India long ago in order to meet the Dalai Lama, which he actually did do that. And I think he lived there even for a little while. So the whole idea is celibacy, vegetarianism, abstinence from alcohol, and of course, finally, the practice of meditation. Sort of, in other words, that enables you to concentrate and to withdraw. Now, Buddhism became popular the Buddha was himself transformed from that Siddhartha Gautama. The Buddha himself was transformed from man into a god. Buddhism became popular because it answered the question about human salvation. And among the sects was Zen Buddhism, which became very popular in Japan. But in general, in China, Confucianism would overshadow Buddhism, and Buddhism would never become perhaps as widely practiced as some of the other faith, or as perhaps as Confucianism. But it becomes a religion. It is religion. And Siddhartha becomes a god, quite literally, within Buddhism. And finally, there's syncretism, and syncretism is easy enough to explain because syncretism is the it refers to the combining of different beliefs, and that was fairly common, and I know it was fairly common in Japan, where they would merge, take a little from this belief and a little from that, and all together. That was what the Japanese would sort of embrace, and that became known as the syncretism. And with that, we can conclude our sort of brief observations, description of this very early period as we launch ourselves into really the history of East Asia. So thank you, and we will talk soon when we will come to the next chapter of the course, Qing China. Thank you and goodbye.